On the Buzz Meter this Sunday, in a week marked by more leaked stories about the Russia investigation, President Trump getting high marks from the media for his trip to Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Vatican, and Brussels.
The president who represented many millions of Americans who were angry, fearful toward the Muslim world, went to the Muslim world and essentially embraced it.
You know, he's had a strong trip to Saudi Arabia and a strong trip to Israel. His message was strong and he hasn't interfered with it.
I think it's gone very well for the president, and I think it was very ambitious, high risk but high reward. That bad things could have happened, some stumbles, but they didn't.
Oh, it's going very well in terms of both the symbolism and in one important respect the substance, which was the speech that President Trump gave in Riyadh on Islam. Was very carefully done. It was nuanced.
But those stories were constantly competing with reporting on the president, James Comey, the intelligence agencies, the Russians, and then NBC and the Washington Post touting this story on Jared Kushner.
NBC News has learned Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and one of his senior White House advisors, has come under scrutiny by the FBI. That's according to multiple U.S. sources.
The confirmation tonight that the man who has been called the deputy president is, as they say, under scrutiny.
He is the most powerful person in the White House, except for the president himself, right? Jared Kushner. And, of course, he's a member of Trump's family. So the investigation is now inside the White House.
What is a non-elected son-in-law doing representing the United States government to be, the incoming administration, to the Russians, our adversary out there in the world? Why is Kushner sitting there talking for us?
Do they have a single named source for the story? Is there a single person? This is the Washington Post that's most disgusting.
And with reports that the president's son-in-law tried to set up a secret back channel to Moscow, is this media uproar justified when he hasn't even been called a target? Plus, the Montana congressman-elect who body-slammed a reporter to the ground.
Anyone that thinks it's unfair or too early to draw a direct line between Donald Trump calling reporters enemies of the state and people beating up a working journalist is ridiculous.
Why are some pundits blaming that violent incident on the president? I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. President Trump back in Washington today after his 9-day trip overseas, a trip that was constantly competing for ink and airtime with the Russia probe back home, especially those reports by NBC and the Washington Post saying investigators are looking at meetings between Jared Kushner and Russian officials a month before the inauguration. Even though the Post said it hasn't been told that Kushner is a target or the central focus of the investigation, and he has not been accused of any wrongdoing. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Joe Trippi, the Democratic strategist and also a Fox News contributor. And Erin McPike, a White House correspondent for Independent Journal Review. Molly, let's start with the trip. Even many of the president's critics, even many liberal commentators giving him high marks on this first foreign trip. Do you think there's perhaps more of a reluctance by the American media to criticize a president when he is abroad representing us?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I do think that the media have failed to understand the significance of Donald Trump's difference of opinion on foreign policy from both Republicans and Democrats, and this trip really did lay a lot of that out. He talked about principled realism. He critiqued both the lectures of the Obama administration and the unnecessary invasions of both Obama and Bush administrations. I think a lot of the appeal that Donald Trump had with voters was in part because of his differences on foreign policy, and the media have really struggled to understand that and really lay that out very well. They paid so much attention to President Obama's Cairo speech where he addressed the Muslim world, and they didn't quite give that same level of attention, even though this was a very significant speech and trip in general.
Well, not so high marks on covering the substance of the trip, Joe. Let's face it, media expectations were low for a rookie president with no experience on the world stage. There's no question he exceeded them.
No, and I think for the most part the coverage was pretty positive, particularly on the Riyadh speech. But what you don't see is a lot of sort of really getting down to the nitty-gritty about not lecturing Saudi Arabia on a lot of human rights and a lot of things, but then going to NATO and lecturing NATO allies on not paying
their
their
fair share of defense costs.
And I think there is a dichotomy there. I agree with Molly that the Riyadh speech was really an important speech for him to give, even with some of the omissions.
A brief moment of consensus. And yes, the coverage of the NATO visit was more controversial. You're just back from Brussels, so you saw some of this firsthand. Didn't the media originally view this trip as a distraction from the problems at home? And did that view change as the president got into the substance here?
I think there was a little bit of a view of that, but remember, this foreign trip has been on the books for a very long time. He actually said sometime in early February that he would be going to Brussels for this NATO meeting. It was essentially even created for him. Now, I would disagree a little bit. I do think the coverage of him was good in Saudi Arabia and also in Israel, and I think that was on substance, but it was much more critical of him in Europe because he did not perform as well in Europe as he did in earlier parts of the trip.
I would actually say, though, there have been many presidents who've tried to get NATO countries to actually increase their defense spending and allocate their funds to actual defense posture. And that goes back to Nixon. Reagan tried to do it. President Trump is actually the first one who's getting people to put out their plans for these defense spending to match what their rhetoric is about the supposed threat of Russia. If people really do think Russia is a threat, these countries need to act like it, and he's saying, act like it.
So let me get your take on the NBC and Washington Post stories about Jared Kushner being under, quote, scrutiny by the FBI, which is kind of murky. But just today, Politico's headline, scandal casts uncertainty over Kushner's future role. New York Times, growing crisis over Kushner. What's your take on these stories?
Well, I mean, under scrutiny is not a legal term. It's a journalistic term that makes it sound like something much worse is going on than actually is going on. If he were named as a target of an investigation, that would be news. At this point, what you have with the media is they're starting with conclusions of wrongdoing and then trying to back up and fill in with stories to support that conclusion that they've already made, that something very nefarious has gone on with this White House, possibly at the level of treason or espionage, or in fact, that's exactly what they're saying, at that level. And that is not a good journalistic posture. You start with the facts and you see where they might go. This is the exact opposite.
And then, Joe, the Washington Post followed up Friday with the story about that others have confirmed about Jared Kushner offering, and this is before the inauguration, to set up a secret communications channel with the Russians, possibly using their communications gear at the embassy or the consulate. And this is according to U.S. intercepts. So the question is, that's kind of interesting. Maybe it was a naive move on his part, but is there anything necessarily nefarious in an incoming administration wanting to be able to have secure communications, or is this a case of, the press making too much of its own suspicions?
Well, it raises the question of, is there something nefarious going on? And that's compounded by the fact that he failed to report the meeting where this happened. So you put those two things together, and it becomes a real news story.
Kushner failed to disclose a couple of phone calls with Ambassador Kislyak.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But the meetings we may have known about, but we may not have known the content of.
But that seems important. It seems like those are two things that he should have disclosed, since Russia is such a focus right now and such a problem.
And then you have the problem of a pattern of 18 such meetings from different players in the White House.
Mike Flynn and others.
Who forgot, didn't report.
But there's such a contrast in the coverage, Aaron. So when these stories broke, and they both broke at night, Thursday, Friday night, I was flipping around. CNN and MSNBC just did hours and hours and hours. They virtually did not come off it. All kinds of panels talking about the Kushner story. Fox barely mentioned it in prime time. It's had more limited coverage during the day. So who's right?
It should be somewhere in the middle. Here's the thing. Jared Kushner, as you played at the top, is a very influential figure in this White House. The press has reported that he is a very positive influence on President Trump. However, we don't know some of what he's doing on the side. He's obviously hardworking, but it is time for Jared Kushner to come address the media, say what it is he's doing, and take some questions.
Not included in this coverage is any mention that there's nothing wrong with what he's even alleged to be doing by anonymous sources. This is the 11 billionth story based solely on anonymous sources. Nobody's named in any of these leaks. And then it's all presented as if something really bad was happening. Actually, setting up back-channel communications is a totally normal thing. So even if it's true, it's not a big deal.
Not using the Russian technology and their secure sources of communication to have that channel.
You know,
that is not...
the media are pushing two simultaneous stories right now. One story is a leak campaign fed by intelligence agencies that can't keep any information discreet if their lives depended on it. And another is that it's supposedly bad to try and avoid these intelligence agencies that can't control any secrets.
You brought up the question of leaks. Just a couple of hours ago, the President of the United States had something to say about this on Twitter, put it up on the screen. It's my opinion that many of the leaks coming out of the White House are fabricated lies made up by the hashtag fake news media. Now, you can dispute whether these leakers have agendas and whether or not what they're leaking is significant, or the press is making too much of it, overblowing it, making this a huge crisis for the president's son-in-law. But fabricated lies?
Fabricated lies is pretty strong and over the top, and that is the president pouring gasoline on the fire, and that was irresponsible.
My favorite part is White House leaks. These are all leaks from the White House that are fake. I mean,
right.
Yeah,
well, but
what he's claiming is that these leaks don't actually exist, that they're fabricated. That is quite the claim to make. At the same time, it's true, we have no ability to judge these leaks. They aren't, you know, it's always a possibility that you're going to use an anonymous. So we're led to believe, but we don't have any way to independently determine if that is true. And that's the problem with relying solely on anonymous leaks. We have no ability to judge these for ourselves. Nobody's willing to put their name on any of these things. And I'm sorry, but what have the media done in the last year to justify that we would trust them on anything?
That tweet comes from the President of the United States, who is out there saying, I love WikiLeaks. I mean, come on, he spends a year screaming about how wonderful leaks are, and now leaks from his own White House,
let me just
places.
move us along, because you know there's so many stories that I can't even get them in every Sunday. So some days ago, Washington Post reported that President Trump had asked Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence, and NSA Chief Michael Rogers to push back against Comey's FBI probe, both supposedly refusing. There was this moment when the president was in Israel and everybody was up live on the cable news networks, and then suddenly there was a chyron saying Mike Flynn is taking the fifth in response to a Senate subpoena. Do you think if journalists are having trouble keeping up with this blizzard of stuff that maybe a lot of the public is, or is tuned out some of it?
Absolutely. It is hard to there are so many stories coming out. It's fast and furious that we get away from some of the larger questions, some of the broader issues sometimes, because there's minutia happening every single day. It is hard to follow.
Just briefly, Aaron McPike says that it would be good for Jared Kushner to talk to reporters. Many people have never heard his voice, but do you think there's also a lot of resentment in the media toward Kushner? I mean, he's young, he's rich, he's obviously in his White House job because he married into the family, and therefore kind of disparaging his role, which the president has given him a lot of responsibility.
Well, obviously the media are so emotional about this administration and anybody associated with it, and they seem to have this incentive where they need to bring down the president rather than just do their jobs, which is report accurately on what's happening. I mean, this story...
And does bringing down the president include trying to bring down his son-in-law?
Of course.
Yeah.
And I think that means all the more that they should be careful with how they're covering these things. Stick to facts as opposed to narratives, and also be careful how you present those facts. Don't make everything the most nefarious thing that you've ever heard instead of just reporting what's actually happening.
If everything is an 11, then nothing is 11. I got to get a break in here. When we come back, James Rosen on how a flood of leaks, is undermining the Trump presidency. And later, how is it Trump's fault that a Montana candidate physically attacked a reporter? From the president's foreign trip to the Jared Kushner story, leaks, sometimes illegal leaks, are increasingly driving the news. So we brought in James Rosen, Fox's chief Washington correspondent, here in Studio One. James Rosen, welcome.
Great to be with you, Howie.
You've worked with confidential sources over the years. You were ensnared in a leak investigation during the Obama administration. What do you make of sources leaking to the Washington Post and NBC that Jared Kushner is a, quote, focus of FBI, quote, scrutiny? Not the target of investigation, not the subject of investigation, but just essentially being looked at.
It strikes me as a standard issue leak out of an investigative law enforcement agency at what we might call an embryonic time in an investigation, not perhaps of the same sensitivity or order of magnitude, let's say, as the leaks of President Trump's transcripts of his telephone conversations with foreign heads of state, but probably both to be looked at by the federal government as illegal.
But embryonic or not, this has caused a media explosion, and you have all these headlines and endless segments on certain cable networks saying, you know, Jared Kushner, president's son-in-law, under investigation. Is that a bit unfair when he's not even the subject of investigation? Would you have any hesitancy about running with that story?
Well, if my sourcing was good or if I had a document in hand, no, I wouldn't. And so I can't speak to that because I haven't retraced all of that reporting. But sure, Jared Kushner probably has some good basis for feeling defamed if he, in his own mind, as I'm sure he does, regards himself as innocent. But we saw exactly the same kinds of things during Watergate. People think that because Nixon and his aides left office and were prosecuted and turned out to be guilty, that everything that was leaked about them in the run-up to that must have been accurate, and it wasn't.
Well, it is, of course, a crime to leak this kind of information, but not a crime for reporters in their judgment to decide that it should be published or aired. Now, a whole bunch of leaks to talk about. Theresa May complaining to President Trump. The British were furious over the U.S. side leaking some intel about that horrifying Manchester concert bombing.
The photographs that were leaked for crime scene evidence,
And Trump was upset about it and said that this posed a grave threat to U.S. national security, ordered an investigation. Somebody out to embarrass the president, it looks to me.
Not necessarily. The motivations of the leakers are unclear to us here. It could have been simply to curry favor with a specific reporter at the New York Times, or perhaps to drive the investigation in one direction or another. We really don't know.
You talked about the leaks, and there have been several of them now, leaks of confidential phone calls or conversations between the President of the United States and foreign leaders. There was another one with the Philippine president just in the last few days in which the transcript showed that President Trump, and he's been criticized for this, revealed that there are 2 U.S. nuclear submarines off North Korea. But how extraordinary, I mean, given the limited number of people who would have access to that this stuff is repeatedly being leaked.
Be not mistaken. We are right now, in the age of Trump, witnessing a zenith for illegal leaks of classified information to the news media. It exceeds really even what we saw during the Nixon presidency, and that was a new zenith for its time. It's something this administration has got to get on top of, or it won't be able to survive.
Right, but when you look at motivations, and we don't know the motivations because we don't know the sources, but it seems to me that these are totally designed to embarrass President Trump rather than get out to the public some vital information that the public somehow needs to know.
Sure, there's a taxonomy of leaks, of different kinds of leaks. There are authorized leaks, there are unauthorized leaks. There are unauthorized leaks to make your boss look good. There are unauthorized leaks with other purposes. Right. In the leaking, for example, of the unmasking of General Flynn, which seemed to come from former Obama administration officials, the motivation there very clearly seemed to be to undermine the incoming president.
Taxonomy, I like that word. It kind of elevates the discussion here. So now finally we had President Trump this past week meeting with Bibi Netanyahu and bringing up the subject of a story originally in the Washington Post about what he told the 2 Russian diplomats he met with, the highly classified stuff about ISIS terror attacks. New York Times saying the source was Israel. Let's take a look.
I never mentioned the word or the name Israel. Never mentioned it during that conversation. They were all saying I did.
So by the president saying it's not Israel, doesn't he in effect confirm that Israel was the source of this highly classified material?
Well, I don't think he said it's not Israel. I think he said that the word Israel was never mentioned in the particular meeting, correct?
Which, by the way, the New York Times didn't say that President Trump brought up Israel. He just said that Israel was the source. But again, President sort of put on the defensive and speaking out to reporters because of another leak designed to undermine him.
And in that moment, the face of Bibi Netanyahu was precious to behold, as he couldn't really believe that this was happening and that what seemed like a successful conclusion to a media event was now being derailed by the president taking that question and even clearing out time to do it. I don't think it helped the president, but I think he's got bigger problems right now.
Absolute deluge of leaks. It's just remarkable. James Rosen, great to see you.
Thank you.
Let us know what you think. Media Buzz at foxnews.com ahead. That scuffle in Montana. Do some folks think it's okay to beat up reporters? But up next, Fox News retracts a story involving a heartbreaking murder. Fox News retracted an online story this week, a story about a murder here in Washington after a storm of criticism. Seth Rich, a 27-year-old staffer at the DNC, was shot to death last year during what police described as a botched robbery. There had been unsubstantiated speculation that the young man might have had some connection to WikiLeaks. And the theory was discussed a few times on the air, most notably by Sean Hannity, who's obviously on the opinion side of this network. The local Fox affiliate in Washington and FoxNews.com reported that according to unnamed sources, Rich had leaked tens of thousands of emails to a WikiLeaks official. After the family complained, the network said, on May 16th, a story was posted on the Fox News website on the investigation into the 2016 murder of DNC staffer Seth Rich. The article was not initially subjected to the high degree of editorial scrutiny we require for all of our reporting. Upon appropriate review, the article was found not to meet those standards and has since been removed. On this tragic subject, with no evidence to contradict the police account, that is a very good decision. And it would have been better if Fox's website had never published that story. Fox said it will continue to investigate the story. Now, Hannity initially said that those who accuse him of pushing a conspiracy theory are phony hypocrites because they are pushing the notion of collusion between Donald Trump and Russia. After Seth Rich's parents made a public appeal, his brother Aaron wrote Hannity's producer saying, providing a platform to spread potentially false, damaging information will cause us additional pain, suffering, and sorrow. The two men spoke, and the Fox News host said this.
I totally, completely understand how upset, how hard this is on this family, especially over the recent coverage of Seth's death. However, out of respect for the family's wishes for now, I am not discussing this matter at this time.
Meanwhile, after the liberal advocacy group Media Matters posted a list of Hannity's advertisers, a few of them have pulled their ads from his show. Hannity is accusing his critics of liberal fascism and calls this an effort to silence conservatives. Ahead, Liz Clayman on the coverage of that health bill and the budgetary prediction that 23 million people could lose their insurance. But first, why are some pundits blaming the president because a Montana politician tackled a reporter? Montana congressional candidate Greg Gianforte generated huge headlines when he slammed a reporter for The Guardian to the ground. This after Ben Jacobs walked uninvited into a side room, thrust a tape recorder at the Republican, and started asking about the health care bill. Fox News correspondent Alicia Acuna was standing right there.
I did see the whole thing when Gianforte grabbed him by the neck, both hands, slid him to the side, body slammed him, and then got on top of him and started punching and then yelling at him. And Ben Jacobs eventually kind of scrambled to his knees, grabbed his glasses, and you heard him talk about his glasses being broken and that he wanted the police called.
Gianforte was charged with misdemeanor assault, and 3 Montana newspapers withdrew their endorsements over this thuggish behavior. But some pundits quick to blame the incident on President Trump.
You don't think it's because a guy who's in office now has said very horrible things about reporters and has said that the reporters are the enemy of the American people?
No,
I think that has nothing to do with anything, that people feel that they can get away with it, because I don't believe that you actually believe that.
A guy assaults a reporter, which I guess shouldn't be too surprising in an age of Trump where he calls the press enemy of the people. These reckless words have consequences.
We're back with the panel. Molly, I think we can all agree that violence against reporters is unacceptable and disturbing, and that for a candidate to physically attack a reporter on the eve of an election is also, by the way, politically stupid. But how did this become Trump's fault?
Yeah, it is true that political leaders have a moral duty to model civility with reporters, and reporters should also model civility with those that they cover. But it's insane, basically, to think that this has to do with Donald Trump unless you believe evil never existed in the world until Donald Trump was on the scene. This has nothing more to do with Donald Trump than you would blame Democrats for Bob Etheridge manhandling a reporter at the closing days of his election campaign in 2010. He was a Democrat. This was before Trump was on the scene. You wouldn't blame Trump for that. You can't blame Trump for this. People need to take responsibility for their own behavior in the same way that the media's rhetoric with regard to the president has been extreme. And I don't think they would want to be blamed if anything happened to the president.
I hate all this guilt by association stuff. I mean, during the Obama administration, some on the right blamed President Obama when a police officer would be shot, saying it was his rhetoric, he had blood on his hands. I didn't like that. I don't like this. How is Donald Trump responsible for Greg Gianforte, essentially slugging this guy, acting like a thug and breaking his glasses?
Well, I don't think you can make that case. I do think the president hasn't been exactly the model that Molly was talking about.
He's attacked reporters rhetorically.
Yes. That's right. But the other thing is he doesn't help himself when he tweets this morning, congratulations for a great win in Montana, and at no point has said that this was abysmal abusive behavior that shouldn't happen. He's never done that. Now, that doesn't mean that you can connect him or blame him for what happened to Ben Jacobs, but I am saying he kind of just never really pushes back on this stuff.
He should have condemned it as opposed to just saying we had a great win in Montana. I think both President Obama and President Bush probably would have done that.
Well, now, Gianforte apologized after the election, which he did win. Of course, there was a lot of early voting in that state. But earlier he put out a statement saying, or his office did, saying, these were badgering questions from an aggressive behavior from a liberal journalist, as if that justified. And by the way, the gotcha question that set him off was about the CBO score on a health care bill, as opposed to something more personal.
Yeah, so I actually had the opportunity to interview Gianforte about a month ago when I was in Montana doing a story on the race, and I found him to be a particularly uninspired candidate, and he is going to have a lot of questions when he gets to Washington. You're seeing a lot of...
Did you find him to be hostile?
He wasn't hostile, but he was not really able to answer tough questions, and he couldn't really answer why it is that he wanted to come to Congress. So he, I'm sure, will find a tough audience when he gets to Capitol Hill.
Well, you know, I guess the argument is about whether President Trump, with, you know, his criticism on fake news and using phrases like enemy of the American people, is creating a dangerous climate. And we can debate that. That's a fair debate. But I still feel like people are responsible for their own actions. And this guy might have done this if Donald Trump was still, you know, selling golf courses.
There really is something to be said, though, about the need for politicians and those who cover them to model good behavior. And we have not seen that on both sides. There is no justification for body slamming a reporter. And also there's no justification for how the media have created sort of a climate of distrust. They use double standards, unfair rhetoric. People do take that personally. It is important for the sake of the republic that we all work to improve our behavior, and that's every single one of us, even those of us who are just reading or consuming the news. We need to work together as a country, and everyone needs to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward.
Sometimes you get caught in one of these media scrums in places like New York, and it can get, you know, you can get elbowed in the head, inadvertently or otherwise. This was not that.
No, I mean, look, if this set him off, the CBO score, I mean, come on. I mean, like, I can't, you know, when this guy gets here, as Aaron says, this could be a big problem.
What about the CBO score? All right, now, the thing that got an enormous amount of media attention, way beyond what it deserved, had to do with Melania Trump, the First Lady, and some video. We've got two pieces of video we're going to play here. What I will call the alleged hand slap. Let's put up the first video. There they are walking. Okay, here's the close-up. Now, we're treating this like the Zapruder film. Now, was this an actual slap, or did she just pull her hand away? I lean toward the latter interpretation. Can you break it down for us?
I'm sorry, you lean toward what interpretation?
She pulled her hand away, but I didn't quite see the contact of a slap. Why is this getting so much media attention?
Well, because he did try to hold her hand and she didn't want to do it, and maybe she was high-fiving him if that's a generous read of that video. I don't know, but it looked like she was walking away a little bit.
Well, as we're talking, let's look at a second video. I think this is when they're coming off a plane. Yeah, and once again, the First Lady not interested in the hand-holding thing, but so why?
That has never happened to me.
Never. Even when you were 16?
Yeah, no, never. That's never happened.
All right, but I'll ask you the high road question. The high road question is, take these incidents, all right, it's gossip, everyone goes crazy, but is there an effort to sort of understand their marriage through these little glimpses?
Right, that's exactly what's going on. People are trying to get a great deal of meaning out of these little snippets. At the same time, there are pictures of the two holding hands. So
on this trip?
Yes, and so it all kind of depends on. But more than that is that we should also remember that if you're focusing on this type of thing, it's an indication that the trip went pretty well, because you're not wanting to talk
That's the worst thing they can say about it. All right, Joe Trippi, Molly Hemingway, Aaron McPike, thanks very much for joining us this Sunday. Coming up, the media portray the president's budget as heartless toward the poor. Is that fair? And later, Billy Bush breaks his silence about that Access Hollywood tape.
Well, back in the mid-'70s, I was in my first Fleet Squadron tour, and we were working up to go on a deployment. And during that time, we went on a port visit. And we were pretty full of ourselves. We were young naval aviators, all fired up. And we went out to this restaurant in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, up on a hillside. And while we were there, we looked out off the patio, and there, out in the bay, was the USS Forrestal. And this gentleman came over from a table across the room from us, and he said, "Are you guys from that aircraft carrier?" And we said, "Yes, sir." And he said, Well, can I buy you dinner? Because I look out there, and when I see that, it makes me so proud to be an American. And all of a sudden, we were humbled. We took all that naval aviator hoorah, and we were humbled the fact that somebody actually appreciated what we were all about, what we were doing, and had that kind of love of country.
President Trump may have been overseas, but the release of his first budget made plenty of news and negative headlines. Washington Post, steep budget cuts don't sit well with many in GOP. New York Times, budget is bad, GOP fears, but it's a start. And here's Times columnist Carl Hulse. Finally, some good news for President Trump. His new budget stands absolutely no chance of being enacted by Congress. Joining us now from New York is Liz Clayman, host of Countdown to the Closing Bell on the Fox Business Network. And Liz, the media are casting this budget as hurting not only the poor, but many working-class Trump voters. Is that fair, and is that the whole picture?
I've actually seen more pointedly harsh headlines on this budget, on President Trump's budget, than I have on the Manchester bomber.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I scrutinized a bunch of this so that we could effectively talk about it, but is it fair? Well, what can the press do, and what should the press do but go to Capitol Hill? Because right now we don't have a CBO score, a Congressional Budget Office score yet, on that budget. So they go to Capitol Hill, and of course the Democrats are quite vitriolic in their dismissal and their criticism of this budget, including some of the cuts from, for example, the National Science Foundation. You know, you dig into the weeds and you find that there were spending plans on there to do sort of research on things like the fashion industry in Turkey or Viking textiles in Iceland. And here's the best one, $700,000 spent by that organization to create a musical on climate change. A musical. Not study climate change, but a musical. So the Democrats lose legitimacy when they can't even say that one or two pieces of this need to be cut and that that's appropriate what the president has floated. Right. So they go to the Republicans, and guess what? Some Republicans, and I'm just talking about blue state Republicans, are very critical of it, Howie, and they say it's DOA, dead on arrival on the
Yeah, I was going to make that point. But, you know, for the press, anytime you have a budget where you're cutting federal spending, it's easy to portray as unpopular because you can go to potential victims and they can talk about how this will hurt their lives. But at the same time, there's another side to this, which is, you know, the taxpayers have to pay for all this stuff. And I wonder if you think that focus is sometimes lost, particularly in the coverage of this particular bill.
Well, nobody wants to be realistic. However, I also looked around for people who are being realistic about it. On CNN Online, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who used to be the head of the CBO, put an op-ed on there, and right away he said, it is not as bad as everybody says. What we have is unsustainable. And we all know that. We have too much spending, not enough tax revenues, and measly 2% growth. So at what point do we wake up and realize that we absolutely have to reform this? And when President Trump put out his budget, he put out his priorities. His priorities were to not touch Social Security and Medicare, which of course are huge spending plans, to add more spending when it comes to the military and to veterans organizations, and to pay the interest on the debt, because you just have to do that. So if those are his priorities, the press has to look at that and say, all right, let's take it from there.
Right. All right. Now, on the health care bill that passed the House, we now have the Congressional Budget Office scoring, saying that 23 million people over a decade would lose their health insurance coverage, some of them with pre-existing conditions. It's only slightly different than that original House bill that failed. This morning, New York Times editorial, Trump Care, cruelty reaffirmed. How does the press referee this when some Republicans are saying, well, CBO, nobody believes them, they've been wrong before?
It's fascinating to watch how some press do referee fairly, like, you know, you see the hockey referees in the National Hockey League. They just want to make sure that they're making the right calls. That's the important thing to do here, and many of them are not. They are only pointing out this headline number that says 23 million over 10 years will not be insured. Well, part of that has to do with the fact that this Trump plan, this health care plan, eliminates that mandate, that rule that you have to buy coverage.
Right. So some people will drop it.
Exactly. But then people are now putting us right back where we were, where they don't buy insurance, and yet they show up at the hospital at their worst point. My dad was a doctor, Howie. He said they come at their worst point, and that falls on all the rest of us who do pay insurance because costs go up. So there has to be an answer to that. But as you look at the Trump plan, you have to realize that there are things that had to change. Obamacare was going to buckle under its own weight. It already is. Talk to anybody in certain states where there aren't any plans left or just one single choice.
The coverage often leaving out that part, and I think that's a really important observation. I love the way you drill down on these things. And now that I know your father's a doctor, you know, we'll ask you for this kind of advice. Liz Clayman, thanks very much.
He was a urologist, Howie, so it's very specified, depending on what you need.
Depending on what you need. Great to see you.
Thank you, Howie.
After the break, the president meets the Pope, and the media focus on Melania.